Oh, welcome to Thinking Green. I'm Rana, and I'm here tonight with Cathy Zall, the Executive Director of New London Homeless Hospitality Center. And Cathy has been a frequent guest, and we kind of missed last winter, which was a usual repeating time slot for circumstances beyond our control. But I'm glad to have Cathy on playing catch up a little today. So welcome, Cathy. Now, I think you're pretty well known around town, but maybe you want to start and talk a little bit about how you got started with this. You know, it was very recent. St. Francis House had its 25th anniversary, and I know that there's a link, and the homeless hospitality table was right next to our Thinking Green table, so you know that was auspicious. So yeah, when did you?
I was a minister in Old Lyme, at the First Congregational Church in Old Lyme, and from that place I was invited by the pastor of the church, David Good, to become what he called a missionary accountant at Koinonia Farm down in Americus, Georgia, which is the birthplace of Habitat for Humanity. So I started to learn about intentional Christian communities, you know, through that. I got back to Connecticut and I was reading a newsletter from another intentional Christian community in the South, and there was this St. Francis House, New London, and I was like, wait a minute, I'm in Old Lyme, they're in New London, who are these people? And so I just called them up and got to know Father Emmett, and was just sort of slowly brought into that orbit. And when the initial sort of crisis of people dying outside in the woods came, you know, Father Emmett just said, I'm not living in a city where people die in the woods, and we're going to do something about this. So I was like, okay.
And in the beginning, there were a lot of the pastors of the various progressive congregations in town.
It was a lot of it was faith communities of all denominations. Some of it was citizens, but basically, you know, it was Father Emmett was the spark that got us all together, and basically gave us that vision of we weren't going to just do nothing, and it's kind of grown from there in kind of remarkable ways.
And I guess he might have been the first one for a while to like just shine a light on the fact that people die out there, because I think sometimes it goes pretty unremarked.
I'm sure that's true, and I think it's not that people didn't know that people died. I'm sure they did. It's just they weren't like Father Emmett, and they didn't just see it and look away. You know, Father Emmett he had that spirit of, we're going to try to do something, and that's, as you know, is rare, because a lot of people can talk about problems or see problems, complain about problems, but actually feeling, you know, energized to really do something about it, that's not as common.
So to go a little bit more down memory lane, what were the first steps that were taken back, I don't know,
20 years ago.
20 years ago.
I mean, very simple, which was Mount Moriah Fire Baptism Holy Church, exactly what they're called, opened the doors, put some mats on the floor, and said to people who were outside in the cold, come in. That's where it started. Volunteers, a bunch of volunteers, and it sort of evolved from there. But that was the other thing I loved about Father Emmett. He didn't let the, perfect be the enemy of the good. And so, okay, right now we can open the doors, let people sleep on a mat on the floor. It's better than being outside in the cold. And it kind of evolved from there.
And it did start out as a winter shelter. I
It
think
did start
for
out as
many
winter.
years,
Yes.
It was protection against really the harsh elements.
That's exactly right. Yes.
And it moved around a little to a couple other churches.
Yes, we spent most of our time when I was here at St. James. They hosted us for many years, which was really appreciated, until we eventually got our own site. So, yeah.
So now you've grown a lot, and you do a lot more than just put mats on the floor, in the winter especially, to get people out of the cold. So let's talk about the different locations you have, and maybe just start with, Huntington Street, and then we can talk about.
Yeah, so our main site is 325 Huntington Street, or 730 State Pier Road. And there we have our emergency shelter and sort of the front door of the homeless response system for people newly experiencing homelessness. That's primarily what we have at Huntington Street.
Now, how many spaces do you have? How many people
can
you accommodate?
Well, our capacity is 40. So if I think about maybe 5 or 6 years ago, we would have a very small wait list. We could accommodate. Right now, we normally have about 20 people on our wait list who need shelter, but we're full. So we have 40 is our normal capacity, and then in the winter, we are allowed under emergency protection for people. We are allowed to open up and have some additional people at the site, but our capacity, official capacity, is 40.
So other than having beds for people, what kind of things do you do there?
Well, I think this is so critical that obviously having some place to sleep is really important and really, really valuable. But the point of what we do is to help people get back into housing. That's the point. The point isn't to run more and more, bigger and bigger emergency shelters. And so really the focus of what we're doing is once people have a chance to breathe and rest and just feel safe, is to start talking about what are the alternatives. And so there we have an on-site community health center, has a clinic on site. Sometimes medical issues are an issue for people. We have an employment specialist who helps people look for work. We have people that help people apply for benefits, including SSI, to help them with that. And then we have a really robust housing unit that try to help people locate housing. So it's really an all-out effort to help people. And again, people are amazing, right? People have been through unbelievable hardship, unbelievable barriers. We're just standing beside them with resources without which it'll be very hard for them to succeed. But it's really people's own energy. The vast majority of people, they just want a place to live. They just want to feel safe. They want to feel like they have that stability.
Now, as I recall, this remembering Father Emmett, one of the key points was that people could come as they are.
Yes.
That there wasn't a big list of prerequisites. Oh, you can't drink. You have to have been off drugs for a month. That
right.
People deserve a roof wherever they are.
Right. Well, and I think one of the things, and this has become much better understood, I think, today, is that there used to be this theory that, the cure to addiction or to other problems, to let people hit rock bottom, that somehow, and that doesn't work, right? There's a lot of research. So basically what we're trying to say, and that this is completely where everybody I think now understands, is that what you want to do is give people a base, and then they have much more chance of addressing the problems that are holding them back. So we are a low barrier shelter. Again, we are behavioral. There are behaviors. You can't be fighting, you can't be, doing things that are harmful to other people. But we don't, as you said, we don't ask, have you stopped drinking? Have you done whatever? Because again, let's let people come in, So long as you behave appropriately, we want to be there to stand beside and help people, because that's what lets them move on in their lives.
I think developmentally too, that when people are in the middle of being in a huge amount of stress, they really can't do long-range planning. Their brains just can't do that until they can rest.
And I think one of the things we understand much, much better now is the impact of trauma on behavior and the brain. And I don't even want to start with some of the trauma beginning in childhood that many people who are experiencing homelessness, and it gives you sort of a hypersensitivity and an anxiety that is very profound. And so yes, you need to have that chance to feel some safety, to feel some companionship, to feel like you have access to some resources. And that's what helps you overcome that almost instinctual panic that seems to come with experiences of trauma.
Are there any, I don't want to say profile exactly, but is there any particular sort of person that you see over and over, or does it run the gamut?
No, I think this is such an important point. People have this vision of homelessness of, and this is a part of homelessness, people who are seriously addicted to drugs, and people who with serious mental health problems, people who are living outdoors, et cetera. If I had to guess, I'd say that's 5%. Okay, it's real, but it's small. The vast majority of people, I would just say two things. The first is that they are very poor. And we are seeing an increasing number, for example, of seniors on fixed incomes. And if your income is $1,000 a month, which is what many seniors that we see, it doesn't take much before you can't find someplace to live. And the second thing is, something that I think some of us that have money forget, is that a bump in the road, you get sick, you miss work, your car breaks down, you get laid off, it's when you don't have money, even a month, even 2 months, it doesn't take long before you slide from just making it to not making it. That, to me, is the vast majority of people experiencing homelessness, is they were either been poor for a long time, or they've had some kind of situation in their life that has upended their stability. And then recently, we see a fair number of people who are being displaced from places they've lived for years because their properties have been purchased by an investor. And again, we live in a capitalist system. There's nothing, I'm not saying there's any evil to this, but that investor is not looking to continue to rent apartments at $1,000 a month. They're looking to upgrade and rent at much higher rents that people can't afford. And we see increasing number of people that are getting eviction notices. This building's been sold, you have to get out. They start looking, they can't find anything.
It is kind of a problem of capitalism. We lived as Kibutz members for 4.5 years, and way back, like 50 years ago. But one of the things is, if you were going to be there, they found someplace for you to sleep. There was a dining room. It was like summer camp in atmosphere a little bit. And you just ate. Like, there are just some things. If you needed work clothes, you'd get work clothes, and none of that stuff came out of your pocket. And now it's like everything you need, you have to cough up the money for yourself.
Right, and I think that's partly due to a capitalist system, but I don't think it has to be, right? In other words, we could have a system that recognizes that one of the fallouts of a capitalist system is there will be some people who will be displaced and not able to succeed. Right. We could help them, Yeah. We could invest more in trying to prevent people from being, completely destitute and homeless. So I think there are strategies we could deploy.
Yeah, and some of the safety nets don't maybe have to be so close to the ground.
Well, and I think that's a very good point. And I'm amazed, for example, in the homeless response system, that if you're, not 7 days away from the street, we can't help you, right? So they make it 14 days for people over 60. But again, and I understand there's limited resources. You want to save resources for the people who are the closest to the crisis of homelessness. On the other hand, when I think about all the stress and all the, what's happening for people, yes, couldn't we move this safety net a little upstream?
Yeah, really. When we're thinking about housing, people do tend to at least think a month ahead. And that isn't a lot either, but it's better than a week or two. You also find, because I look back on my life, and I think most people look back on their lives, and there have been times when they have been in kind of vulnerable situations, but they've had a support network, either family or friends. So are many of the people who you see at the shelter people who either are not from here and their support networks aren't close by, or for other reasons, childhood trauma, or the fact that other family members aren't really better off, they don't have that option?
Yeah, it's mixed. I mean, again, like everything. But I would say that if I was talking a little bit about the front end, where we're really trying to work with people to divert them from homelessness, often the solution is to find a family member where they could stay. And that can be difficult, but we do a lot of that. Can we get on the phone with mom and let's talk? And could we maybe help? Could we buy a pull-out sofa that could be put someplace in the house, in mom's house, so that you could go there? So we spend a lot of time, and it has actually a name which I like, which is housing-focused problem solving. So we're really trying to collaborate with the person and their network. But part of the problem is that many very poor people, their network also includes mainly very poor people, and maybe their significant family members live in public housing, for example, where you're not allowed to have extra people in your apartment, or maybe they're unstably housed themselves. So again, I think, sometimes people's networks are a lot more stressed than maybe the network that we might have.
I'm thinking that at its very best, it's only something, not really a solution to be on a relative's couch, but that does stretch the week or two window of really getting things together to maybe a few months.
Right, and again, I know this is very controversial, but I think we need to start thinking differently, because not everyone can afford their own apartment. So we need to be talking about what we call shared housing, or roommates, which many of us had when we were starting out or when we were in college. And people just freak out about, oh, we're going to have 2 or 3, 4 unrelated people sharing a 4-bedroom apartment. I think we have to start thinking about these things, because I can afford a quarter of a 4-bedroom apartment a lot more than I can ever afford an efficiency, or let's say a 1-bedroom.
Well, I read a really great article years ago from the blog Strong Towns, and the article was called "What the Movie Little Women Can Teach Us About Housing or Zoning." And part of the point was that, before there was zoning, which was conceived of as being rather segregationist, but you had a middle-class working family living next door to very wealthy people in a mansion. There was a very poor family living down the road. And then when the one daughter went to the city, she lived in a boarding house. And so there were all of these different options. And the interesting thing was that people who lived in all these different options did meet each other. They knew each other.
Yep.
And that, I think, the economic segregation that we have with present day zoning rules kind of prevents well-off people from having friends who are less well-off. And I think it does sometimes affect, people's views when they're thinking about what policies should look like.
I think that's right.
So, yeah, in some ways I hate zoning, even though I'm really interested in it. So that's, I think that was your first site, right? The church over on State Pier in Huntington. So let's talk about the other locations you have and what you're doing at them. And I don't know what order you want to
Yeah, so why don't we just
about.
briefly talk about 727 Bank Street, which is
Okay.
our administrative office. There, as you said, we've grown, so we do have some administration. And then we have a number of workers who work one-on-one with people to help them stay housed. So these are not people experiencing homelessness. They're people who are, on their way to housing or in housing. And so we're doing that work there. We also do some work with trying to help people stay in their homes. A very good state program, somebody who's in a nursing home, but could go home if they had the right supports. We do some of that work. So to help people leave nursing homes and live independently. And then we own we are property, we're landlords, and so we have quite a number of units, and so we have people that help keep those units fixed up and collect rent and stuff like that. And then, I'm sorry.
And then there are, well, because as I'm driving from my house, like near the hospital to the studio, I pass the Friendship Street property that is not quite ready to go, but looking
Almost.
pretty close. So
Very close.
what are the plans there?
Yeah, so that was funded by the Department of Housing. There's 2 duplexes, so 4 units, each with 3 bedrooms. So there'll be 3 people sharing one side and another 3 people. So altogether, 12 people that will have housing. It's just a beautiful site. It's just, it just shows, like, if you could just get on the ball and there's funding available. And it's simple, but safe and very, very nice. And I think people are going to be so thrilled to live there.
So when someone goes out and lives in a regular apartment in the community, what kind of supports do you find that they continue to need at these?
Well, from us,
beginning?
it's fairly limited. There's a small number of people that have what's called permanent supportive housing, where they do have ongoing support. That's a very small number, and that's individuals with some kind of a disability. For most people, our goal is to help them sort of launch back into housing, try to be there beside them for some period of time, but then utilize community resources, whether that be mental health, whether that be health, whether that be employment, whatever. So then people integrate into the community.
Now, when people are renting these apartments, is it time limited at all?
No.
Or
These
you
are
can
just regular, straightforward
Right.
leases. And there's a variety of different funding sources. Some of them are very short-term, called rapid rehousing. Some people, there are some vouchers. So there are some individuals who have vouchers which help them pay for their rent. And then there's people who just pay. But our units are around $800 a month, everything included, utility, internet, everything. Whereas a 1-bedroom is now at least $1,300 a month without utilities. So we're almost half the cost of a market, so that makes it accessible to people who are earning much, much, much less.
And a lot of people who are doing essential jobs are earning much less.
Yes, for sure. And it's not just people without income. It's not just seniors. It's all of the people who are working in grocery stores and home care attendants and all just people that we rely on every day that are struggling to find housing, yes.
Yeah, well, I was a preschool teacher, and fortunately I was married. It was the second income. We still weren't very wealthy, but at the time, like 40 years ago when our kids were young, there was, I don't know, affordable rental around. One of the first places we rented, we lived 15 years in a barely winterized beach cottage in Waterford. It was a nice neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
The house was very shabby, but it was kind of perfect. And our rent in 1980 was something like $300 a month. And it had gone up to $600 a month when we decided it was time to buy our own place in like 1994. So it wasn't a subsidized house, but because, the property owner had purchased these houses for very, little money, the property taxes were very low. He was really trying to just recoup his expenses while he gained equity. And it wasn't like he had shareholders or a millionaire CEO or anything. And I think there's less and less of that sort of rental around, which makes it really important.
Yeah,
what
and
you're adding.
The supply and demand has really gotten out of balance.
Yeah, and I think rents are partly going up. Property taxes went up in New London, as we know, but I saw recently that in Norwich, people's property taxes went up 50%. Residential one?
I don't know.
I don't know. I had not heard anything about it until I saw something on Facebook today, and I thought, oh my gosh, New London was nothing compared to that.
Yeah, I don't know. I just know that rents have gone up very substantially, and I think some of it is market forces. It's not just
Right.
utility costs have gone up or property
Right.
taxes have gone up. I just think the market out there, and it's, and look, I think we need housing at all levels. I am not at all, we need housing
Right.
for the doctors who are at, and
Right.
for the, engineers, and we need it all. The question is, are we putting enough effort into addressing all of the housing needs, including the needs of people at pretty low incomes? That's where I think we need to put more focus.
Yeah. And I think there are some zoning solutions that, some things that were common, boarding houses
Yes.
at one time that are largely frowned on now. And things like cottage courts,
Yes.
Yes. There is a little cottage court in Waterford on Spithead Road. I don't know, like 10, it's like a campground, 10 little tiny houses really around a courtyard. And I'm sure the rents are quite reasonable. But it's hard to get those, that started the way our current zoning laws are.
It is. And I think, I think we have to somehow figure out how to really have that discussion, because otherwise you're going to have more and more people on the street. I honestly don't see, if we don't find a way to have more housing, I don't see where that leads but to bad things.
So, moving on, the most recent location that you open, I think, I've been seeing an office on State Street, which
Yes.
is the Housing Counseling Center, or I'm not sure what it's called.
Housing Counseling Agency, yeah.
And tell us what that's about, because that's kind of a new thing you've gone
Yeah.
into.
Well, we were doing it and started doing it at 727, but we were prevented from continuing to do that by zoning. But we were very committed and are very committed to Housing Counseling Agency, so we were able to locate space on State Street, which is allowable use there. And basically the idea of a Housing Counseling Agency is a number of things. They're kind of certified by HUD, Housing and Urban Development, very rigorous process of training and of whatever else. And basically the idea is to provide housing-related supports, not to people experiencing homelessness, but to other people. And so rental counseling is one of the functions that we fulfill as a HUD Housing Counseling Agency. And that's everything from helping people get ready to be renters and understand their obligations and opportunities, to helping people deal with fair housing. I have mold in my house. The landlord's not fixing something I need to have fixed. What do I do? We help people who want to go to the rent commissions in their towns. We've had a number of situations where landlords were doubling somebody's rent, and we were able to help the person advocate with the Fair Rent Commission. All of that rental-related things, and then eviction prevention. We do Unite CT and what's called the Moving Assistance Program, so help people who are facing eviction, so that rental counseling. The second big area, which I think is so important, is first-time home buyers. So as we know, historically, certain broad swath of the population was not able to buy homes, maybe 50 years ago, and therefore there's the generational wealth. And so there's a whole variety of programs available to first-time home buyers. And some of those programs require that you have to do an education program and housing counseling, and we do that as well. So every month we do first-time home buyers, help people figure out how to buy a home. We have some fabulous volunteers, legal and about mortgages and about what to look for, and just help people get started, and hopefully buy a home. Although it's hard right now, but people do.
Yeah, and in New London, there are a lot of people, residents here, who don't have the generational wealth.
Yes.
And that's an extra challenge. Well, okay, so 4.5 years ago, we started going through COVID. Or was it 5? And that presented challenges that I'm sure we've talked about. Now we've come mostly out of COVID, but a lot of the resources that were made available for a few years are disappearing. So how is that whole landscape of COVID and then COVID sort of becoming just a fact of life, and now everyone's supposed to go back and act like it never happened? How's that affecting your programs?
Well, I'm glad the height of COVID is behind us. I have to say that was probably the scariest part of my working life, was those early months of the COVID situation, because we're a shelter. We had to stay open. I had to ask people to keep coming to work when we didn't know how it was transmitted, and were they going to take it home, and their grandmother was going to get sick and die.
There was a vaccine.
It was just a nightmare, because we had to stay open, I felt, because otherwise what were we going to do? Like put everybody onto the street? And so I just feel incredible courage that a lot of people that work with us showed by coming in every day and continuing. So COVID behind us is a good thing. But I think you're exactly right, and we're not the only part of this. There was a huge investment, which probably we should have more on an ongoing basis, but there was a huge investment, and that money is coming to an end. And there's many, many parts of the safety net that were shored up by that COVID funding, and I'm sure it's going to be a nightmarish legislative session as people try to struggle with where can the state step in and replace some of those resources, and where can't it? And I can't imagine this isn't going to be a very, very difficult setting priorities, because it was a large influx of money that was very needed, but unfortunately is still needed even after COVID's no longer quite the crisis it was.
Yeah, I had been hopeful briefly that there would be a real incentive to make more healthcare more public, because for the first few years of COVID, you could get tests at no cost, out-of-pocket cost, so people didn't have to think, oh, I don't feel great. Do I want to get a COVID test, or do I want to eat lunch? They didn't have to make that choice, because you could just go get the test and not worry about who's paying for it. And the same thing with the vaccines. You could go and get immunized, and you weren't having to make a decision prioritizing, your various needs in life. And I thought, people might get a real feel for what like a real universal healthcare system feels like. It didn't go that way, unfortunately. So speaking of healthcare, though, I know that if you go to your website, you say you're very careful. You don't duplicate things that other agencies, other groups are doing, and a lot of those other things are healthcare related. So do you want to talk a little bit about your various partnerships with other organizations
Yes, sure.
and agencies in New London?
So the first one I think I would just call out is the Community Health Center. They have obviously their main office down at Shaw's Cove. They have a small clinic right inside the shelter, staffed by unbelievable people. Just Catherine Hinojosa, Dr. Hinojosa, and a number of others. And so they run the space, they pay the staff, and I think for them the advantage is that they reach a population who are not so able to schedule an appointment 3 weeks from today to come to another location. So they run it like a drop-in. They just see a tremendous number of people, connect people to healthcare. So I love that. The second, I'd say, partnership I would hold up is Alliance for Living and their navigators, their recovery navigators. Again, unbelievable people that have experienced themselves of dealing with substance use disorder, and they are just fabulous. If we have anybody who seems to have some interest in recovery, connect them to those navigators, and they are fabulous. What resources do you need? How can we help you? How can we connect you to treatment? And then we have the visiting nurses. Southeastern Connecticut have a wellness nurse, Nurse Deb, and she is like on the move always, just talking to people, helping them with their health care. And then finally, I'd say we have I think a really remarkable partnership with L&M Hospital, Yale New Haven Health, and the hospital helps us do a very small respite part of the shelter so that people who are just just had an operation. Our regular shelter, you do need to leave the sleeping area at 8 o'clock or so in the morning. But in respite, people have their own room, they can stay and recuperate. So this helps the hospital because it lets them discharge people when they no longer need to be in the hospital.
But they don't want to discharge them onto the street, of course.
And, I'm sure you've heard in many cities horror stories of people being discharged from the hospital to the street. So what a waste of medical resources to spend all that money to help somebody get, well, and then discharge them to the street. But that's not here, right? So I'm very grateful to the hospital because they recognize, and their assistance is really pretty critical in helping that happen.
Now, when I looked at the website, you had also mentioned on it a SCAD in the fire department, and I was a little surprised to see the fire department. So,
well, the fire department runs our ambulance service, and unfortunately, we make more use of ambulances than we're constantly trying to deal with that, right? So, but let's just say, we have a lot of calls that come to our place, and this is a problem, and I understand that. We're trying to work on it because the firefighters have or the ambulance crews, there's a lot of need, and we don't want to use that resource at all when it's not necessary.
So let's talk a little bit about like the face of homelessness.
Sure.
We hadn't really talked about veterans yet, but I'm thinking it's been the case for quite a long time that veterans do make up a significant percentage of the homeless.
Well, actually, the Veterans Administration has invested heavily in addressing homelessness. So the percentage of veterans that are experiencing homelessness is actually lower now than it was 10 years ago because of this investment. So we have, you know, a variety of programs to assist veterans, and those programs are well funded by the VA. And so again, I think it just shows if you put the resources behind it, the majority of people can be assisted to get out of homelessness and back into housing.
And there's some housing that's specifically earmarked
There
for
is,
vets.
yes, there is. And there's vouchers earmarked for vets, and again, this is appropriate, right? I mean, there's individuals that have served, and sometimes their, you know, their struggles relate to their service. Sometimes they don't, but sometimes they do. And so I think it's obviously very appropriate. But you know, what I think we do is that it's one thing to have a policy, it's one thing to have a funding source, but you got to actually do it on the ground, and that's where I feel we try to really excel.
And you had mentioned earlier something about the elderly, and I know I talked to Jean Milstein, I don't know, maybe a year ago. I bumped into her, and that was one thing she was talking about,
Yes.
how she was really kind of dumbfounded. She had never seen so many elderly people experiencing homelessness who never had in their lives. So do they have,
It's stunning. It's really stunning. And when we built the shelter, we put the sleeping area on the second floor. It's one flight of stairs up. And we now have so many people who cannot navigate one flight of stairs because they have a walker, an oxygen tank, you know, other kinds of. I think probably now 20% of the people in the shelter are over 60. We have recently, I think the last time I was there, a person who's 75, another person who's 79.
Wow.
You know, again, frail, mobility challenged, and we've had to sort of try to glom together, you know, some first floor space because we just have more and more people. And most of the people who are older people are people who lived someplace for a long time, you know, paid their rent, you know, whatever. Their housing got sold, the rents went up, and they could not find anything else. And I think people would, you know, maybe don't always absorb that there are people who are trying to live on a very modest Social Security, maybe $1,200 a month. And if you have disability,
person on Social Security does not make a living wage.
no, and if you have what's called SSI, which is for people
Right.
who have disabilities, is $971 a month. And so, you know, I think it's not a surprise that we're seeing more and more people. And I think I was looking at some of the senior housing, because that's obviously, you pay a percentage of your income, that's great. Hundreds of people on the waiting list. If you're 70 years old, to get on a 15-year waiting list is not a strategy, right?
Right.
So I think, again, if we had more capacity, if there was more senior housing or more what are called residential care homes or other resources, it would be one thing. But that supply is just not expanding, and therefore people are ending up experiencing homelessness.
Wow. Well, I wanted to talk a little before we run out of time, although that's not imminent. I think we have about 10 more minutes. But how can people learn more about what you do? What are the different ways that people can support the Homeless Hospitality Center and your various endeavors?
Yeah, well, financial support is always welcome. We need it, and we rely on private donations to sort of make up the difference between what we do. And again, you know, I think we don't have room for clothing, you know, so we don't run clothing banks, but I encourage people to the Jumble Shop at St. James and other places, because that's useful. But I think I would like to sort of also just encourage people to think about volunteering. And that can be anything from maybe you come with your family or your faith community or your bowling club, you know, once in a while to bring a meal or whatever. And we have people who come once a week, you know, and work at the front desk or work in our help center or whatever. And I'm sure you're familiar with Brian Stevenson from, you know, wrote Just Mercy and stuff like that. And one of the things he recommends to people who are interested in justice is he says, get proximate. It doesn't mean you're going to make best friends with people, but I think there's something about just being in the environment. I can't tell you how many people who volunteer at the shelter say, either I met my coworker, former coworker, or my neighbor from down the street, or the person I went to high school with, or they just say, oh, you know what? I see it. This is just people. These are people like, you know, and not all of them, but, you know, some people that volunteer, it could have been me. And so I think there's something about just taking some time, getting to know something of the realities of what that's like. So you know, on our website, and there's many other ways to volunteer, of course. So I just think that's something I would recommend for people to think about.
Do you still provide tours?
Yes, we don't.
We
will always arrange
a
tour. We will always arrange tours, but COVID did sort of put a kind of a stopped our traction on that.
Some things just haven't really come back after COVID.
Yes.
But yes, well, you know, when you mention that, you know, the getting proximate thing, I do think that's huge because I don't, you know, we think about the kind of segregation that was, you know, practiced 70 years ago or 50 years ago, you know, when we were little kids. And it's interesting because it seemed like there was racial and ethnic segregation, but not so much economic segregation.
Could be, I don't know. There could be, yeah.
Yeah, and you know, there were different kinds of houses in old neighborhoods, some one families, some two families, some apartments. And now it's like everyone who lives on a block, their houses are kind of worth the same. They're all kind of in that same economic stratum. And I think there's a real misunderstanding that's leading to well, kind of a criminalization of homelessness.
Well, and I think some institutions that used to kind of maybe have a bigger cross-section of people like faith communities, because those are shrinking, that was a place where people from different backgrounds, and not necessarily much Rachel, because even like faith communities were kind of segregated, but there was so I think people don't know each other and it's like that's the other, and whatever we can do to break that down, I think would be a good thing.
Yeah, it's really hard to battle that. I have to say, it's been one of my frustrations, you know, with working on zoning things, that sure, like people who work in fancy offices, well, why shouldn't they, you know, outside of work be aware of the lives of the people who are, you know, mopping their floors or serving in the cafeteria? But it seems like it's really hard to do it.
Well, and I think the more you don't know people, the more they become scary. And so I do think, like, I'm sort of amazed, you know, there's still people who talk about those people, that phrase, which I thought everybody knew. We don't say that anymore. But if you don't know, and listen, I think this has always been true, like, if you just don't understand people who are different than you because you've never actually interacted with somebody of a different faith or a different sexual orientation or a different nationality or whatever. And so I do think there's something about knowing a broader range of people that opens us up to seeing the humanity that we all share.
Now, what would you say are like the biggest challenges you anticipate over the next, I don't know, 6 months or a year or a couple of years?
Well, I'd say there's two. I think the obvious one, of course, is the supply of housing. I think this is really a serious problem. And the second one is economic and poverty and income inequality. I mean, income inequality in itself is an issue, But I think that, honestly, I don't think it's good for any of us to be creating an increasingly large number of people who are virtually desperately poor. I don't think that's right. I don't think that's ethical, but I also don't think it's smart, right? And so I'm really just wondering whether there's going to be any kind of recognition, whether it's child tax credit, whether it's minimum wage, whether it's subsidies, whether it's whatever. I just think we're headed for a real load of hurt if we don't do something so that we don't create a desperate group of people. And I can't even imagine, we don't deal with families, but I can't even imagine what this must be doing to families and children. Parents who are so stressed, parents who are having to work, these unbelievable hours, who can't afford childcare. I mean, I hate to even think what's happening with that. So I just hope somehow we'll see that it's in all of our interest to create a floor and do more to help people from.
It's hard to get, I think you're really right. I've been following the budget recommendations of Connecticut Voices for Children for decades, urging a more progressive tax system and child tax credits. But right now, Connecticut, I would bet that it's in the top 3 states for income inequality, that we have, a couple of the poorest cities in the country, and then we have some of the richest enclaves of the ultra-privileged. And I don't know that they know each other, or maybe they do, a little bit, but I think if they really did know each other, it would become very obvious.
Well, but I'm also, that is certainly one way, but hopefully also people will see that this isn't sustainable to create really literally desperate poverty. I mean, again, it's not like I know some part of the world where it's really like people are on the verge of starvation. I know we're not at that point, but it's pretty serious, and I think it's not going to be good for all of us if we don't do something about it.
And ironically, it's very expensive for us not to do anything to deal with it. We only have about another 2 minutes, but there are some cities in the country that have just put money into paying a year's rent for people who are experiencing homelessness.
There's a lot of people thinking about this.
And the money works out.
Yeah, I mean, that's the issue. There are people thinking about this, and I just feel like we need to, lean into it and start doing more than just experimenting on the margins and start thinking about how could we do some of these things. That's not my job.
No.
I'm too old for that.
I know the feeling. Let's just be happy retirees.
No, I don't want to do that. I want to
quite
keep
that.
working, but, yeah.
Well, thank you, Cathy. I just want to tell people who are watching, if you have want more information, the website, nlhc.org, has a ton of information, both how you can help or how you can get help, the various services that are provided. And next week, we won't be on live, but I am going to be interviewing State Representative Keith Denning, who is from Wilton. I think it's the 42nd District. And we're going to talk about this legislative session, both what passed and the special session that's coming, but also about his experience working as a medic in Gaza, not over the last 9 months, but several times over the last decade as a nurse anesthesiologist. So it should be an interesting mix of topics, and thank you again, Cathy, for coming on.
Of course.
And thank you all for watching. We'll see you next week.
Don't